Future trading involves risk and is not suitable for all investors. Content provided in this segment is meant for educational purposes and is not a solicitation to buy or sell commodities.
Hi, it's Steve and Joe from Fresh Agenda, Ever.Ag's Global Insights team, and Steve. We are back with a quick weekly take, some brief market updates, a last GDT to talk about after a break of 2 weeks, a bit of trade data, which is interesting, and of course, Chat of the Week. So after a fairly positive pulse result last week, we had actually weaker futures through the rest of the week, Steve. So you can just see that line just relaxing a little bit. Again, just as we hit that, what's expected to be a fairly strong peak in production, just a little bit lower for skim milk powder out of New Zealand.
And the other price action this week, probably the most interesting one, is US cheese in futures rebounded. Spot market's been moving up as well. It's this ironic thing that the spot has been moving up to meet the futures, despite what are some difficult fundamentals. We'll talk a bit more about that as we get towards the end of this. But a pretty interesting GDT result, which, delivered, that's a really mixed bag of results there. Net increase in the index was less than 1%, and that was carried off by some strong whole milk powder contracts where the biggest volumes occur, the second contract, and consistent gains across AMF. Skim is quite mixed, but butter quite weak. Pretty much what we expected with butter because it seems like it's a bit heavy on GDT.
So higher volumes just seasonally on offer at this event, Steve, particularly in powders, and actually the demand was there to absorb it to some extent. So we had improved demand ratios for skim milk powder and whole milk powder. Butter and AMF a little bit weaker for a change this time around, Steve.
Yeah. So whole milk, interesting, a flatter, firmer forward curve in this result.
Yeah, and this really builds on those previous pulse results, Steve. We just see the nice little steps up there to this current result, which is quite a bit higher than event 384 a couple of weeks ago.
Looks like a Tour de France profile map, doesn't it?
It does, yeah, very much so.
Which I miss. In some of the buying, obviously this is probably the most important part, there was a 54% lift in sales at this event. And it doesn't quite line up with offer volumes because you've got different regions offering, but that's a big step up. The second big step up we've seen, Chinese volumes in that context were quite strong, up in percentage terms, highest event volume since late last year and higher than the same event in the last 2 years. So pretty positive takeaway, I would say, Joe, for whole milk in this, given there has been some downward pressure. I think E price got away with itself. The market got away with itself a bit, but here we have an interesting comeback.
And just looking at the Southeast Asian buying, that's also been up on the prior 2 years. It's coming back from, I guess, a pretty deep lull sort of mid-year with the volumes on offer. But, that lower start to the selling season, maybe, people have been keeping their powder dry and they're back at this point in the season. And just again, looking at this trend with the pulse events, it's sort of like New Zealand skim also followed the trend with the previous pulse results, but in the opposite direction. So it's down just a fraction on the previous GDT option, but well down on those fairly positive pulse events in the in-between times.
Skimmer prices diverged a little again. They're all closely bunched, and we had a long period where they were very far apart, but now we're in a tight bunch there, which we also see in futures.
Yeah, and just looking at Southeast Asia and skim milk powder sales, there was a strong lift in skim milk powder buying, again with this seasonally higher volume on offer. Volumes up almost 80% on the prior event. So, again, fairly encouraging support from buyers on this platform.
Yeah, to get a flat result on that uplift is a positive takeaway.
Absolutely. And looking at Chinese buying, that improved as well. Not back to where we were 2 years ago, Steve, which was incidentally on a smaller trade, but still pretty encouraging and just, again, holding those prices pretty much steady.
Butter, we saw tanked across contracts here. Certainly C2 and C3 much weaker. And look, there's always that thing about butter, and butter volumes managed to get tight results, but that's starting to give way now, particularly with the risks of the European market weakening. AMF also flattened out, but with a lift across forward contracts, so really interesting curve there. It's lost that with a big difference here. It's lost that big value, those high prices in
Freakishly higher.
Yeah. So that's come out of it now. We're back to a pretty flat curve.
And just looking at this lovely comparison that I so enjoy, the AMF discount at the contract 2 price at this event fell $500 a tonne, Steve, to a little more than $1,500 a tonne. So just a very big comeback there in this latest event. And my other favourite is the synthetic value of AMF and skim with whole milk powder. Whole milk powder moving a bit higher, and the synthetic values based on those fat and protein prices just a little bit weaker at this event, but still pretty close together there, Steve.
So where does this leave us? The skim or powder comparison is, as I said, tightly bunched. Now we see it's the EEX values which are higher. New Zealand and US actually weaker in futures in the past week. We said, the growth indicators out in New Zealand remain positive, so there's a bit more product, and that's, certainly flattened that line out a bit. Interestingly, the EEX, we don't show it here, but the EEX forward line is still higher than some of those recent over-the-counter trades. So a little bit of heat in that skim futures market, perhaps.
Yeah, and just looking at butterfat now, those global comparisons, and I suppose we've been talking about this for a while, Steve, that, the GDT prices were a little bit out of alignment with what the futures market was saying. Well, it's come very much back into alignment now. EEX still above everybody else, but, a little bit more bunched these days.
Yeah. Okay. US export data came out early this morning, our time. Our team has scrambled to pull this together into the way we represent it. Overall, US exports quite strong, up 21% year on year, and in the first half of the year, 9% higher. That's in milk solids equivalent terms. Here, the butter trade obviously a standout in this chart, doubling year on year, but every measure you want, really. It's doubled in the first half of the year and also in recent months. So reasonably consistent on small volumes relative to the rest of trade.
Yeah, just taking that butter out so you can see a little bit more granularity with those big towers of butter. And pretty much every product category here is strong, Steve, except for skim milk powder. Cheese up 34% year on year. NBC trade has also improved. It's up 8% for the first half of 2025. And WPC 80 trade has also grown 10% in the first half of the year. So that's all pretty positive. Also, these are obviously volume measures, but a value would be even higher, Steve, given the prices for particularly those high pro products. So fairly encouraging numbers here for the US exporters.
And we love to dig into this stuff. Where is the cheese trade going and how does that compare to the rivals? So just breaking this out, you have to wait a bit longer for us to line up all the exporters into the contestable regions, but the US is getting all its growth in the last 3 months from those contestable markets as growth in Mexico and other regions slows. So it's North Asia, Central and South America where it's doing its best work. But it is encouraging that there is a bigger contribution coming from the export market.
And a broader base.
And a broader base, that's right, a broader base. And that's likely to continue for at least the short term. I guess the big thing, though, why we talked about the fundamentals in the US being weaker, which is not seeing the gap filled by the domestic market, which is a much bigger volume of offtake. That is still pretty flat in the latest data. Chart of the week, Joe. What do you have?
Yeah, look, going across to China, and we've got some data out of China, just looking at milk output versus fluid milk processing. And this is something we look at whenever this monthly data comes out. Milk production is better in that it's less worse for this latest month of data, but the fluid milk processing volumes sank further, Steve, just indicating that that consumer demand for fresh product is weaker still. And that means that there's a bit more milk available for processing into or drying into powders. And we did see that, Steve, with whole milk powder production increasing 10% year on year. And it's the first time it's lifted for quite a while, Steve. So, in the context of this very good result for whole milk powder, it's probably not what we wanted to see out of China, but obviously there's still gaps to fill there.
Great. Okay. Thanks for watching. We'll be back again next week.